There is a kind of water that doesn't forget. There exists a water that remembers. You can submerge a thing beneath 60 feet of it. You can allow 20 years worth of catfish to drift through the windows of the house where you first drew breath, and the water will cradle all of it, still and patient, like a palm closed over a coin. And then one parched summer, when the rains refuse to fall, the water will drop, inch by inch, and it will return precisely what you entrusted to it. That's how this one begins. Have you ever stood at the edge of a shore and felt, for no reason you could name, that you were poised atop something, that the ground beneath the water was gazing back at you? Before I continue, I want to know where you're hearing this tonight. Drop it in the comments. The town, the county, the kitchen table, wherever you are. I read every single one, and I take pleasure in knowing how far this story travels through the dark. A note before this truly gets underway. If the kind of case I'm recounting here is something you'd want to hold in your hands, the actual depositions, the ledgers, the photographs, I've collected 7 of them into a dossier, the Appalachian Dossier. 7 files retrieved from county records between 1843 and 1891, restored exactly as the clerk transcribed them. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now then, the man this happened to was named Alden Coldwell, and in the summer, the water gave the cabin back. He was 51 years old, a tall man. Taller than most doorways in that region were built to accommodate, and he carried himself with a slight stoop at the neck, as tall men often do after a lifetime of passing beneath low beams. His build was the long, lean kind, not frail, but spare, like a fence post that weathered 40 winters and isn't about to rot for 40 more. His hands were the first thing folks noticed about him. He'd been a chainman and a rodman for the survey crews before the dam, and later a lineman for the power company. The work had layered caluses across his palms, so thick that shaking his hand felt like gripping a piece of tack leather. A white scar ran from the corner of his left eye down into his jaw, an old one from a snapped cable, though nobody but Alden recalled the cause anymore. His eyes were gray, the flat gray of river ice, and they had a way of drifting elsewhere, in the middle of conversation, as though he'd caught a sound beneath your words that you couldn't hear yourself. He grew up in a town called Renick's Ferry. I want you to grasp what Renick's Ferry was before it vanished, because the whole of this turns on it. It sat in a bend of the White River, where the water ran shallow enough most of the year for a flat ferry to be hauled across on a cable. At its peak, maybe 90 souls lived there, counting the families spread up the hollows. There was a store with a tin roof, a church with no steeple, because the men had never gotten around to raising one, a smithy, a mill that ground corn for a tithe of the meal, and a long, crooked main road that wasn't so much a road as a habit the wagons had worn into the bottomland. People were born there, married there, and laid to rest there, up on the ridge in a fenced square of stones. Most of them never ventured farther than the county seat and back in their entire lives. Alden's people were ferry people. His grandfather had run the cable, and his father after him, and Alden would have run it too, if the river had stayed a river. But in the late 1940s, the government men arrived with their tripods, their maps, and their checkbooks, and they explained very patiently to 90 people who had never been asked their opinion of anything that the white, river was going to be made to stand still. They were going to throw a wall of concrete across it downstream. A wall taller than any building any of them had ever laid eyes on. And behind that wall, the river would back up, rise, and spread out across the bottomland until Renick's Ferry lay at the bottom of a lake. They called it progress. They called it flood control, electricity, and a future. They weren't lying, exactly. The dam got built, and it did hold back the floods that used to sweep the bottomland every spring. And it did light up farms that had burned coal oil since the day they were settled. I won't stand here and tell you the dam was evil. It wasn't. It was just enormous, and it didn't care. What it asked of Renick's Ferry was simple. Leave. Take your money, your kin, your furniture, and your livestock, and go, and we will move your dead for you to higher ground. And then we will let the water in. Most everybody went. There's no shame in it. When the government decides a place is going to be underwater, the place is going to be underwater. The only question left is whether you're standing in it when the time comes. They moved the graves first. That was the law. And that was a hard, strange autumn, the autumn of 1949. Watching the men dig up the ridge and read the worn names off the stones and carry the boxes up to the new ground above the waterline. Alden was on that crew. A young man then, not yet 30, strong, with a young man's certainty that the world was something that happened to other people. He helped move his own grandfather. He told me once that the box came up lighter than he'd expected, and that the lightness of it troubled him for years, though he could never say why. They moved the living, and they moved the dead, but they could not move Elam Winterbourne. Now, I have to tell you about Elam, and this is the part the county never wrote down, because there was no clean way to write it. Elam Winterbourne lived alone in a cabin at the far end of the bottom, up against the foot of the ridge where the good land gave out and the rock began. He was an old man by 49, somewhere past 60. Nobody knew exactly, because Elam had been old as long as the oldest people in town could remember him being anything. He'd had a wife once, long before, and she had died or left. The story shifted depending on who told it. After that, he kept to himself. He trapped and kept bees. He sold honey and hides at the store and took his pay in coffee shells, and didn't say more than 10 words a season to anyone. He wasn't disliked. He just wasn't known. There's a difference in a small place between a man people don't like and a man people don't go to see. And Elam was the second kind. His cabin was the last building in Renick's Ferry that anyone would have called a house. It was a good cabin. Elam had built it himself, dovetailed the corners so tight you couldn't slip a knife blade between the logs. And he'd kept it. The roof didn't leak. The chimney drew clean. When the buyout came, Elam took the money. That surprised people. He took the check the same as everybody. And the men of the town figured that was that. The old trapper would drift off to wherever old trappers drift. And the water would have his cabin same as everything else. But the months went by, and everybody else loaded their wagons and trucks, and went, and Elam Winterbourne did not go. He stayed in his cabin at the foot of the ridge with the bees and the hides. And when the men from the power company came to remind him that the gates were going to close and the water was going to rise, he stood in his doorway and looked at them with his flat old eyes and said he wasn't done yet. Wasn't done with what? They asked him, and he just looked at them. Here is the thing about Elam Winterborn, that I can only give you the way it was given to me, which is sideways, in pieces, from old people speaking low. Sometime in that last year, the year the town emptied out around him, something changed at the cabin at the foot of the ridge. The change came on slow, the way the worst things do. First it was that Elam stopped coming to the store. Then it was that the bees left. The whole apiary, every hive, swarmed off in a single afternoon, which beekeepers will tell you bees do not do.
Not like that.
Not all at once. Not in the wrong season. Then it was the smell. The smell came down the bottomland on the evening air, and it wasn't the smell of an animal dead, though that's what people first took it for. It was sweeter than that, and worse than that, and it had under it something cold, a mineral coldness, like the breath of a deep cave. People found they didn't want to walk toward Elam's end of the bottom anymore. They didn't decide it. Their feet just declined to carry them. And there was the matter of the men who went to check on him. 3 men at different times in that last year walked down to Elam Winterborn's cabin to see was he alive. Was he sick? Did he need anything? 3 men. And here's all I can honestly tell you about what happened, because it is all that the old people would say, and they would only say it once, and they would not be asked to say it twice. 2 of those 3 men came back from the cabin and would not afterward speak of it, and one of them sold his place at a loss inside the month, took his family 3 counties away, and was never heard from in Renick's Ferry again. And the 3rd man, who walked down to Elam Winterborn's cabin, did not walk back up. I'm going to leave that exactly there, because the record leaves it exactly there. And I'd rather tell you a true silence than a comfortable lie. By the autumn of 1949, the town was empty but for Elam, and the gates downstream were near ready to close. And a hard thing had settled over the dozen or so men who still had business in the valley. The survey men, the company men, the few like Alden, whose families had been there longest and who'd stayed to the last to see the old place off. They would gather in the evenings up at the abandoned store, and they would not say out loud the thing they were all turning over, which was this: that they could simply leave, that the water was coming anyway, that whatever was down at the foot of the ridge, in Elam Winterborn's cabin, the lake would take it, and they could be 100 miles gone before the first water touched the doors. And they would never have to know. That's what most of them wanted to do. But there was an old preacher in those parts named Lucius Grimshaw, a circuit man, lean and hard as a hickory rail, who'd buried half the valley and married the other half over 50 years of riding from hollow to hollow. And Brother Grimshaw said a thing to those men that I've turned over in my own mind more nights than I'd care to count. He said that water doesn't cleanse what men are too cowardly to face. He said that if they let the lake close over that cabin, with the door standing open, and whatever was inside it free to come and go, then they were not drowning the thing. They were only teaching it to swim. And so they did not run. What they did instead, on a cold night in the late autumn of 1949, with the river already swelling at its edges as the gates choked it down, was go to Elam Winterborn's cabin in a body, a dozen men with lanterns and tar buckets and kegs of cut nails and stacks of green oak planking. I have spent years trying to learn exactly what passed at that cabin that night, and I have given up. Because the men who were there made a pact never to speak of it, and to a man they kept the pact to their graves. I know only the shape of it. I know they sealed the cabin. I know they nailed planks across every window and battened the door from the outside, and then poured hot pitch over the seams until the whole structure was black and shining and sealed up like the lid of a jar. I know that whatever was inside the cabin when they began, and I do not know with certainty that it was still Elam, and neither, I think, did they, was inside it when they finished. And I know that not one of those dozen men ever again, for the rest of his natural life, would go near deep water at night. Alden Coldwell was one of those dozen men. He was the youngest of them, not yet 30, and he held a lantern, and he handed up planks, and he drove nails into green oak with the rest. And he heard. He told me this, the only detail of that night he ever gave me. He heard from inside the sealed cabin when the last plank went up, a sound, not a scream. He was careful about that when he told me. He said it would have been easier if it had been a scream, because a scream is a thing a frightened man makes, and a frightened man is still a man. He said what he heard from inside was a knocking. 3 slow knocks on the inside of the battened door. Patient, almost polite, the knock of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. And then the river came up over the next many weeks, slow and brown and final, and Renick's ferry went under, the store and the church with no steeple, and the mill and the crooked road, and the empty cabins and the fenced square of ground on the ridge where the dead used to lie before they were moved. And at the far end of the drowned bottom, under 60 feet of new lake, sealed in tar and green oak, the cabin of Elam Winterbourne settled into the dark and the cold and the silence, and the water closed over it. And that, for almost 4 years, was the end of it. Let me take a breath here before what comes next. Because what comes next is the summer the water gave it back. And while we're stopped, if you're with me this far into the dark, you already know what kind of channel this is. This is the fear behind you. And we put these out so that the stories that should never have been buried get told out loud the way they were meant to be. If that's worth something to you, subscribe and stay close. And if you're hearing this somewhere that isn't our channel, then somebody took it without leave, and you'd be doing us a kindness to let us know. Now, have you ever woken up some ordinary morning with the certainty sitting cold in your chest that something far away had shifted in the night? That a door you thought was shut had come open while you slept? If you've ever had a feeling like that, and the feeling turned out to be right, tell me about it down in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one who's lived it, because that's exactly how it came to Alden Coldwell on a morning in the August of 1953. The summer of '53 was a dry one all across the Ozarks. The rain that should have come in May didn't, and what fell in June fell somewhere else. By July, the corn was curling, and the creeks that fed the lake had gone to strings of warm green pools. And the lake itself, the great new lake they'd made, began for the first time in its short life to shrink. The power company drew it down to keep the turbines turning, and the drought drew it down on top of that. Week by week, through that long, dry August, the water line crept down the raw clay banks and left behind it a widening ring of cracked gray mud. studded with the stumps of the drowned forest, stinking in the heat. 24 feet. That's how far the lake fell that summer, measured at the dam, 24 feet below the line it was meant to hold, and 24 feet in the shallow upper end, where Renick's ferry had been, was enough. The old bottomland began to come back up out of the water. It came up wrong, of course. It came up as a flat of stinking mud where a green valley had been, dotted with the black stubs of orchard trees and the foundation stones of houses, and here and there the rusted carcass of something too heavy to have been hauled out before the flood. Folks from the new towns around the lake drove out to look at it the way folks will, and walked out onto the dried crust at the edges and picked up bottles and horseshoes and called it a marvel. The newspaper in the county seat sent a man with a camera for a week or two. It was the sort of thing people talked about. The lost town come back, the past laid bare, all of that. Alden Coldwell did not go to look. He'd worked the dam and the lines for the power company for 4 years by then, and he lived in one of the new towns, alone in a small frame house. And he had made it his particular business never to go out onto that water, and never to look too long at it from the shore. The men who had been at the cabin that night in 49 were like that, the ones still living. They'd scattered, but you could tell them by the way they sat with their backs to the lake at a picnic, by the way they'd find a reason to leave a fishing trip before dark. But on the morning I told you about, in the middle of that dry August, Alden woke before light with his heart going hard and the certainty in him cold and complete that something had come open in the night. He didn't know why. He told me he lay there in the dark of his own bedroom and listened to nothing, to the ordinary tick of the house cooling, and the feeling would not leave him. It was the feeling, he said, you get when someone is standing in a doorway behind you, looking at the back of your neck. He got up. He made coffee he didn't drink. And when the sun came up, he got in his truck and, without quite deciding to, drove out the gravel road to the upper end of the lake, to the place where the old bottom had come back up out of the water. He left the truck at the end of the road and walked out onto the dried mud. The morning was already hot. The whole flat shimmered, and the stink of it rose up around his boots. Out across the gray waste, he could see the stumps and the stones, and far off the bright thread of what was left of the river, snaking through the middle of where the lake had been. He knew the ground. That was the worst of it. 4 years under the water, and he still knew it. Knew where the church had stood, where the road had bent, where the mill race had run. His own feet carried him the way a man's feet will carry him through the rooms of a house he grew up in. Even with his eyes shut, they carried him to the foot of the ridge, and there it was. The cabin of Elam Winterbourne had come up out of the lake hole. I want you to understand how wrong that was, so let me say it plain. A wooden building does not survive 4 years underwater. The lake should have swelled its joints and rotted its sills and floated its roof off, plank by plank, and left nothing but a low black smear in the mud. Every other structure in that drowned town had done exactly that. The store was a heap. The mill was a stain. The cabins were tumbles of slime-black logs. But Elam Winterbourne's cabin stood at the foot of the ridge in the morning sun, square and sound and shining, its logs dark with old tar, its windows battened with planks gone the color of iron, its door shut and sealed. Exactly, as a dozen frightened men had left it on a cold night 4 years before. The tar was intact. Alden walked all the way around it twice, his heart slamming, and the tar was intact. The nails were where they'd driven them. The green oak planks across the windows hadn't sprung a single board. Whatever the lake had done to the rest of Renick's Ferry, it had not so much as wet the inside of that cabin. The seal had held. Nothing had gotten in, which meant, and Alden stood there in the stinking heat with this thought going through him like cold water, which meant that nothing had gotten out. He didn't touch it. He told me that very clearly more than once, as if it mattered to him that I believe it. He did not lay a hand on that cabin. He stood in front of the battened door, close enough to read the heads of the nails he'd helped drive when he was young, and he listened, and the cabin was silent. He waited a long time. The sun climbed, sweat ran down the scar on his face, and just when he had begun to think that maybe 4 years of dark and cold had finally done the work the lake couldn't, that whatever had knocked on the inside of that door in 49 had long since gone quiet for good. Just then, from inside the sealed cabin came 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, patient, polite. The knock of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. Alden Coldwell did not remember the walk back to his truck. He told me there was a gap there, a stretch of that morning he never got back, between the sound of the 3rd knock and the moment he found himself sitting behind the wheel with the engine running and both hands shaking too hard to put it in gear. He drove straight to the county seat. He drove straight to the sheriff. Now, the sheriff that summer was a man named Wade Winterbourne, and I have to tell you the thing about him that makes this story sit the way it sits. Wade Winterbourne was Elam's blood, a great-nephew or some such. The families had thinned and scattered, but the name held, and Wade was of it. He was a younger man than Alden, somewhere in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with a heavy, careful way of moving and a face that gave nothing back. And here is the part. Wade Winterbourne had been at the cabin too. Not as a man, he'd been too young for that. Just a boy, and in 1949, 15, 16 at the most. But his own father had been one of the dozen, and the boy had begged to come along the way boys do. And his father, God help him, had let him hold a lantern at the edge of the lamplight, while the men did their work. So Wade Winterbourne had stood in the dark at the foot of the ridge and watched his elders seal that cabin. And he had heard, same as Alden, from his place at the edge of the light, the 3 slow knocks on the inside of the door. He had carried it his whole life, and he had grown up and pinned on a badge in the county that held the lake, and some part of him, I have to believe, had always known that one dry summer the water would lower itself and the thing would come back, and the choosing would land on him. When Alden Coldwell walked into his office that August morning, gray in the face, and said, "The cabin's come back up, and it's whole," and it knocked at me. Wade Winterbourne did not ask him what cabin. He did not ask him what he meant. He sat very still for a moment behind his desk, and then he stood up and took his hat off the peg, and all he said was, "Show me." They drove out together. They walked out onto the mud together, and Wade Winterbourne stood in front of the sealed cabin of the great uncle. He'd watched the men shut away when he was a boy, and he listened. And after a long while, the 3 knocks came, and Alden watched the sheriff's face and saw on it not surprise. There was no surprise in it at all, but a kind of terrible arithmetic, like a man checking a sum he'd already known the answer to for 30 years, and only now had to write down. What Sheriff Winterbourne did next is the part the county did write down, in a fashion. And it's the part the title of this brings you here for. He closed the shore. He went back to town and got on the telephone, and called in every favor, and pulled every string a small county sheriff has. By that evening, there were barricades and hand-lettered signs across every road and track that led to the upper end of the lake. There were deputies turning back the newspaper man, and the bottle hunters and the curious. The official word, the word that went in the paper, and was true as far as it went, was that the exposed lake bed was unsafe, that the mud was deep enough to swallow a man, that the structures were unsound, and that the shore was closed by order of the county until further notice. Public safety. Nobody argued with it. It was even true. The mud would swallow a man, but the real order, the one Wade Winterbourne gave only to the 3 deputies he trusted, was this: nobody goes near the cabin, and the cabin does not come open. Whatever it takes, whatever you have to tell anybody, that cabin stays sealed until the water comes back and takes it under again. And then he set himself a clock. He'd already been on the telephone to the power company and the engineers, and he knew what Alden knew. That the drawdown had bottomed out, that the company was about to start letting the lake refill for the autumn, that the first good rain in the high country would bring the water back up the bottomland fast. The engineers gave him a number. With the gates set the way they were about to set them, and given any rain at all, the cabin would be back under the lake inside 2 days. 48 hours. That's the 48 hours, not the time it took the sheriff to decide. The time he had to hold to keep that cabin sealed and unbothered and standing in the open air before the water he was praying for would rise back up the foot of the ridge and close over it for good. 48 hours of keeping the lid on the jar. And here's where I have to stop and ask you something, because I've never been able to settle it in my own mind. If you'd been Wade Winterbourne, if you'd carried that knocking in your ears since you were a boy, and the water had given the thing back, and you had 2 days to put it under again, and the rest of your life to live with whatever you'd done, would you have done what he did? Would you have held the line and let the water take it and never known? Or would you have needed finally to open the door? Sit with that a second. I'll tell you what he chose. But I want to know what you'd have chosen. Comments, as always. I'll take a breath here before the worst of it. If these are the kind of cases you'd want to read for yourself. Not just here, but sit with the documents. I keep a fuller archive. The Appalachian Dossier, 7 files, 69 pages, with the plates and depositions the county tried to unfile. The link is in the description below and at the top of the comments. Let's go back to it. The first night of the 48 hours passed quiet enough. 2 deputies sat in a truck at the head of the road, with the barricade across it. And the cabin stood out on the mud under a thin moon. And nothing happened that anyone would put in a report, but the deputies, and one of them told this years later to a man who told it to me. The deputies did not sleep. Not because they were watchful, but because of the sound. It carried across that flat, dead mud the way sound does over still water. Faint, but clear, and it came at intervals all night long from the direction of the cabin. 3 knocks, a long, quiet 3 knocks. The deputies sat in the cab of the truck with the windows up against the smell of the mud, and did not speak to each other, and did not sleep. And one of them, the one who told it, said the worst part wasn't the knocking. The worst part was that toward morning, the knocking changed. It started answering. He said one of them, just to break the awful quiet, rapped his knuckles 3 times on the dash of the truck. Just nerves. Just a man's hand doing a thing his mind didn't order. And out across the mud, after a moment, from inside the sealed cabin, came 3 knocks back. The same rhythm, the same weight, as if the thing in there had been waiting a long time for someone outside to play. They didn't knock again. Alden Coldwell came back out the second morning. He shouldn't have. The shore was closed, and he, of all people, had reason to stay away, but he came. And Sheriff Winterbourne, who was out there himself by then, gray and unshaven, having sat up the whole night in his own car at the foot of the road. Sheriff Winterbourne didn't turn him back. I think by then, the 2 of them, the boy who'd held the lantern and the young man who'd driven the nails, understood that they were the only 2 people in the county who fully grasped what was sealed up out there on the mud, and that there was a kind of cold comfort in not being the only one. They stood together a way off from the cabin in the early light, and Alden saw that something about it had changed overnight. And it took him a moment to understand what, because the change was small, and it was wrong in a way the eye didn't want to accept. The door, the battened door of the cabin that they'd nailed shut from the outside 4 years before. The nails in it had moved. Not all of them, a few along the top edge of the door. They'd backed out a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, their bright heads standing proud of the wood now, where they had been driven flush, and the heads were bent outward, the way a nail bends when something pushes on the wood from the wrong side, from the inside. Slow and steady and stronger than green oak was ever meant to stand against. Sheriff Winterbourne saw it too. Alden watched him see it, and Alden watched the sheriff do the arithmetic again, the terrible arithmetic. And this time the sum came out different, because now there was a clock running, and the seal that had held for 4 years was failing in front of them, and the water was not yet high enough. The engineers had promised 48 hours, but the rain hadn't come. The high country had stayed dry through the night, and the lake, instead of rising, had crept down another few inches, and the cabin sat farther out on the drying mud than it had the morning before. The water's edge fallen back from it, the foot of the ridge baking in the sun. The thing the sheriff was depending on to finish this, the water, was that morning moving the wrong way, and the seal was opening from the inside. I think that's the moment Wade Winterbourne broke. Not into pieces, men like him don't, but something in him gave over and decided the way a man decides a thing he's been deciding his whole life without knowing it. He turned to Alden and said, in a flat, dead voice, that the seal wasn't going to hold to the water, and that he wasn't going to stand on the shore and let a thing that's strong work its way loose in the open dark a half-mile from a county full of sleeping people. He said if it was going to come open, It was going to come open on his terms, in the daylight, with the two men who knew what it was standing in front of it, and not in the dead of some night, when nobody was watching. He was going to open the cabin. Alden begged him not to. He told me he begged. He said he reminded the sheriff of the words old brother Grimshaw had spoken in 1949, that the men of Renick's Ferry hadn't drowned the thing. They had only kept it from learning to swim, and that the one mercy in the whole business was the seal. The unbroken seal. The fact that whatever was in there had spent 4 years unable to so much as touch the open air. He said that to break the seal yourself, on purpose, with your own hands, was to undo the one brave thing those frightened men had ever done. He said, leave it. Pray for rain. Let the lake have it. And Wade Winterbourne looked at the nails bending outward in the morning sun and said the rain wasn't coming. And he sent his deputies away. That's a thing I left out, and it matters. He sent the deputies off, back to the barricade out of sight, with orders to let no one through, and to come no closer no matter what they heard. He did not want them to see. Whatever he meant to do at that cabin, he meant for only 2 living men to witness it, himself and Alden Coldwell. And I have come to believe that was a mercy of his own, the last one he had in him, that he carried the rest of his deputies' lives clear of that cabin door on purpose. The way his own father, God help him, had failed to carry him clear of it when he was a boy with a lantern. So, it was just the 2 of them, in the heat of the second afternoon, who walked out across the mud to the sealed cabin of Elam Winterbourne. The knocking had stopped. That was the thing Alden noticed as they came up on it. That the cabin, which had knocked through 2 nights and answered the deputy's rap, had gone perfectly, attentively silent. The way a room goes silent when the people in it hear a key in the lock. The bent nails stood out along the top of the door. The tar gleamed black in the sun, and the smell, the old sweet cold mineral smell from 1949, the smell that had emptied the bottomland of people one cabin at a time, hung around the place now in the still air, heavy enough to taste. Sheriff Winterbourne had brought a pry bar. He set it under the bottom edge of the battened door where the nails still held. And he looked at Alden once, and Alden saw in his face that he knew exactly what he was doing, and exactly what it might cost, and that he was past the point where any of that could stop him. And then Wade Winterbourne put his weight on the bar. The first nail came out with a long shriek of green oak, and from inside the cabin, into the dead silence, a voice spoke. It was an old man's voice, dry and patient and entirely calm, and it came through the planks clear, as if there were no planks at all. And the thing it said, the thing that came out of the sealed cabin of Elam Winterbourne, after 4 years under the water, and 4 years sealed in tar and dark, was a name. It said Alden. Just that. His own name, in a voice he hadn't heard since he was a young man holding a lantern. The voice of an old trapper who'd kept bees at the foot of the ridge. His name, said softly, almost warmly, the way you'd say the name of a friend you'd been expecting for a long, long while, and were glad at last to see come up the path. Alden Coldwell told me that in that moment, he understood several things all at once, and that they have never since let go of him. He understood that the thing in the cabin knew him, had always known him, had been knocking all this time not at random, and not at the world, but at him. that the 3 knocks across the mud had had his name in them from the first morning, and he simply hadn't been able to hear it yet. He understood that the seal had not been keeping a stranger from the world. It had been keeping something that wanted him, specifically in the dark where it couldn't reach him. And he understood, watching Wade Winterbourne stand frozen over the pry bar with the second nail half drawn, that the sheriff had heard the voice, too, and had heard whose name it called, and that the sheriff was now doing one final time the terrible arithmetic, and that the sum had changed again, because the voice had not said Wade. It had not called for its own blood, the boy who'd watched it sealed away. It had called for Alden, and Wade Winterbourne, standing there with the means in his hands to open that door, understood in that instant that he could finish drawing the nails and let the thing have what it wanted and take what came. Or he could choose, the way his elders had chosen on a cold night in 49, to be a coward in the one direction that's also the only mercy. He chose. He let go of the pry bar. He left it hanging there in the half-drawn nail, and he took Alden Coldwell by the arm. Alden told me he never felt a grip like it, that the sheriff's hand closed on him like the jaws of a trap, and he turned him bodily away from that door, and he walked him fast out across the mud, away from the cabin, away from the voice that went on saying his name behind them, soft and patient, and never once louder, all the long way back to the trucks. And he did not let go of Alden's arm until they were both inside the cab, with the door shut. And even then Alden could see the marks of the sheriff's fingers coming up white and red on his sleeve. And then it rained. I know how that sounds. I've told this story enough times to know exactly how it sounds. And I can only tell you it's what the record says, and what Alden swore to, and what the county weather log bears out. That on the afternoon of the second day, with the seal half broken and the voice loose in the open air, the dry high country 40 miles north of the lake finally let go of the rain it had been holding all summer, and it came down hard, and the creeks woke up, and the water that fed the lake began that very evening to rise. It rose all that night. The deputies at the barricade reported the knocking started up again at full dark and went on for hours, but fewer of them now and farther between. And then, sometime in the small hours, with the lake creeping back up the foot of the ridge, it stopped. They reported one long sound near the end, which none of them would describe, and which the man who finally told it said was not a knock and not a voice, but something in between. A sound a sealed thing makes when the water it was waiting for comes up over the doors. At last, and it understands too late what's about to happen to it. And by the morning of the third day, past the 48 hours, but only just, the cabin of Elam Winterbourne was gone again. The risen water stood gray and choppy in the rain over the place where it had been, and the half-drawn pry bar, and the bent nails, and the old sweet cold smell, were all of them down under the lake again, sealed in tar and green oak, and 60 feet of patient water, exactly where a dozen frightened men had put them, and where, but for one dry summer, they might have stayed forever. Sheriff Wade Winterbourne reopened the shore that same week. The official word was that the danger had passed with the rising water, that the unsafe lake bed was safely under again, that there was nothing more out there to see, which was true as far as it went. The newspaper man wrote his little piece about the lost town that came back and went under again, and called it a curiosity of the drought. And that was that. Wade Winterbourne wore his badge another 9 years, and was by every account a good and careful sheriff. And he died in his bed, which is more than some of the dozen got. He never spoke of the cabin to anyone but Alden, and to Alden only once, years after, when the two of them were old. He said just one thing about it. He said, "I drew one nail. I think about that one nail every night of my life." And then he never said another word about it ever to anyone. As for Alden Coldwell, Alden left the county. He'd outlasted the town of his birth and the lake that drowned it, and the thing that came back up out of it knowing his name. And after all that, he found he could not go on living within sight of that water. He took work far off in flatter country, where the rivers ran where rivers are supposed to run, and stayed there. And he married late, and lived quiet, and grew old. And that's where the man who told me all of this finally found him. An old, old man in a small house a long way from any lake. And here is the way it ends, which is to say, it doesn't. Every few years, somewhere out in those Ozark hills, comes another dry summer. The rain forgets to come. The creeks go to strings of green pools, and the great lake the government built lowers itself an inch at a time. It doesn't drop 24 feet often. Most droughts, it falls a little and recovers. But the old men who knew, the few of the dozen who lived long, all kept the same strange habit to the ends of their days. They watched the lake level. They read it in the paper, and on the dry years, the low years, the years the water fell far down the raw clay banks toward the place where Renick's Ferry lies. Those were the years they slept the worst. Alden Coldwell told the man who told me that to the end of his life, on the low water years, miles and miles from any lake, in the dead middle of the night, in a quiet house in flat, dry country, where no such thing should ever have been able to reach him, he would wake, and before he turned on the light, in the dark of his own room, he would lie still and listen. And on the bad years, the dry years, the years the water fell, he swore that he could hear them coming from no door, coming from no wall, coming, it seemed to him, from somewhere very deep and very cold and very patient that had all the time in the world and knew it. 3 knocks, then a long quiet, then 3 knocks, and he never, not once, in all his long life got up to answer. So I'll leave you with the same thing I'm left with. We like to believe that if we put a thing far enough down and seal it well enough, and never speak its name, the water will keep it for us and we'll be free. But water doesn't forget, and some doors, once you've heard them knock, you carry the knocking with you, whether you ever open them or not. Do you think Wade Winterbourne did right, drawing back from that door? Or do you think some things have to be faced, even when facing them is the worst thing you'll ever do? Tell me down in the comments. I read them all. And on this one more than most, I want to know what you'd have done. If you know a story like this one, a place that gave something back it had no business giving back, share it with us. It might be the next one I tell. Stay close, keep a light on, and I'll see you on the far side of the next one.